Inside Creedmoor Psychiatric Hospital in the 1940s, medicine looked more like punishment than healing, and behind the sterile walls, three young brothers, Arthur, Mortimer, and Raymond Sackler, spent their days performing lobotomies and electroshock therapy on patients whose minds had already collapsed under the weight of misunderstanding. They believed they were pioneers, men trying to cure madness by silencing it, yet each electric surge left them uneasy, wondering if the real problem was not the soul, but the chemistry of the brain itself. If the mind could be switched off by force, could it also be switched back on by design? That question followed them through every corridor, whispering that somewhere there had to be a cleaner, simpler cure, a pill that could quiet pain without violence. It sounded noble, almost heroic, but that single thought would lead them away from medicine and into business, toward a company that would one day redefine addiction. Because sometimes the line between treatment and control is thinner than anyone dares to admit. Pause for a second and subscribe, because this story begins in a hospital, but it won't end where you think it will. Arthur Sackler was the eldest and the most ambitious of the three, and while his brothers stayed in medicine, he saw something far more powerful than science. He saw persuasion. Leaving the hospital behind, Arthur entered the world of advertising and quickly realized that the way to change medicine was not through discovery, but through belief. He founded a marketing company and began selling pharmaceuticals like they were consumer goods, hiring doctors to promote drugs to other doctors, paying editors to publish favorable studies, even creating fake medical endorsements that never existed. The lines between ethics and profit blurred until they were indistinguishable. Arthur didn't just sell medicine, he sold trust. And once he learned how to manipulate it, he could make the world crave anything. The more he understood human psychology, the less he cared about its limits. And perhaps that's when the real experiment began, not in the hospital, but in the marketplace, with an entire nation as his patient. By the 1950s, the three brothers had pooled their ambitions into a single goal: control. They purchased a small, struggling pharmaceutical company called Purdue, convinced that the future of medicine wasn't in hospitals, but in pills. While Mortimer and Raymond managed production and logistics, Arthur turned his marketing genius into their greatest weapon. He had already transformed tranquilizers like Valium and Librium into cultural phenomena, convincing doctors that everyday anxiety required chemical relief and that no one should have to live with discomfort. His campaigns blurred the line between illness and inconvenience, teaching America that every feeling could be medicated. When reports of addiction appeared, Arthur dismissed them with a chilling logic. The problem wasn't the drug, it was the people who couldn't handle it. That mindset became Purdue's foundation, the belief that responsibility ended at the prescription pad. What began as a vision of healing had quietly become a business model built on dependency. And the Sacklers were just getting started. By the late 1980s, Purdue's best-selling painkiller, OxyContin, was nearing the end of its patent, and with competition looming, the Sacklers faced a threat to their empire's future. They needed something stronger, more profitable, something that could dominate the market the same way Valium once had. The idea was deceptively simple: take an old, powerful opioid called OxyContin and wrap it in the same time-release coating used for OxyContin. They called it OxyContin, a pill designed to release its power slowly over 12 hours, supposedly making it safer and less addictive. On paper, it looked like innovation. In reality, it was the perfect disguise for danger. The drug worked well for cancer pain or post-surgery recovery, but the Sacklers saw a much bigger market: everyday pain, bad backs, sore knees, headaches. And if OxyContin could be sold not as a last resort, but as a lifestyle cure, the profits would be limitless. But to pull it off, they would need something much bigger than marketing. They would need approval from the government itself.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.
To sell OxyContin as a safe, everyday painkiller, Purdue needed the FDA's approval, and not just approval, but language that would make doctors believe it wasn't addictive. That's where a medical officer named Curtis Wright came in. Wright was supposed to be an impartial reviewer, yet instead of keeping his distance, he worked side by side with Purdue executives, even letting them draft parts of the drug's official review. For 3 days, company representatives camped near his office, shaping the very document meant to regulate them. When the approval came, it included a single vague sentence that would change everything. Delayed absorption is believed to reduce the abuse liability of the drug. Believed by who? Based on what? No one asked. That one line gave Purdue a license to lie. Sales reps began telling doctors that the FDA itself had confirmed OxyContin was virtually not addictive. And soon after the approval, Curtis Wright left the agency and started working for Purdue for $370,000 a year. Coincidence? Hardly. With FDA approval in hand, Purdue unleashed one of the most aggressive pharmaceutical campaigns in history. Hundreds of sales representatives were sent across the country, armed not with medical knowledge, but with rehearsed talking points and a mission to convince doctors that OxyContin was the miracle painkiller they'd been waiting for. They promised 12-hour relief, low risk of addiction, and happy patients who could finally return to normal life. To make it believable, Purdue flooded hospitals with glossy brochures, fake studies, and free samples while showering doctors with gifts, luxury dinners, and paid conferences disguised as education. The company spent millions each year just on food for physicians because a meal, they learned, could sell more prescriptions than any research paper. And it worked. Sales exploded. Doctors prescribed it freely, and addiction began to spread quietly through towns and cities. Purdue knew exactly what was happening, but in their eyes, every new patient was just another number on a sales chart. The pain market had become the profit market. When reports of patients showing clear signs of dependency began to surface, Purdue didn't admit fault. They invented a new term to explain it away. They called it pseudo-addiction, a concept suggesting that if a patient appeared addicted, it was only because their pain wasn't being treated aggressively enough. The solution, according to Purdue, wasn't to cut the dose, but to increase it. The idea sounded scientific but had no real evidence behind it. It was nothing more than a clever marketing tactic dressed up as medicine. Doctors were told that cravings and withdrawal were signs of undertreatment, and Purdue repeated the message so often that many physicians began to believe it. Even the man who coined the term, Dr. David Haddox, went on to work for the company as its spokesperson, pushing the narrative that patients didn't need restraint, they needed more pills. The result was catastrophic. Addiction wasn't seen as a warning sign anymore, it was mistaken for progress. And that lie would turn a medical crisis into a national one. As the drug spread across America, addicts quickly discovered that if you crushed an OxyContin tablet, you could destroy its time-release shell and unlock the full dose instantly. The rush was almost identical to heroin, powerful, pure, and terrifyingly easy to get. Pharmacies were overflowing with prescriptions. Doctors had been told it was safe, and entire towns in Appalachia began to fall into dependence. Teenagers experimented, workers relied on it to push through pain, and crime spiked as people robbed pharmacies for pills. In some regions, nearly every household knew someone addicted. The press called it hillbilly heroin, but there was nothing rural about the epidemic. It was spreading everywhere. Inside Purdue, executives read the reports, saw the overdose charts, and told staff to delete any mention of abuse. They weren't selling medicine anymore, they were selling escape, and they knew it. Yet, instead of pulling back, they doubled down, because every crushed pill, every new addiction, still meant another sale.
When addiction and overdose reports became impossible to ignore, Purdue's leadership didn't admit responsibility, they blamed the people taking their drug. Internal emails revealed that Richard Sackler, now president of the company, called those suffering reckless criminals and the scum of the earth. To him, the addicts were the problem, not the product. It didn't matter that many of them were ordinary patients following their doctor's instructions exactly as prescribed. Purdue's official stance was that misuse came from bad behavior, not bad science. Behind closed doors, staff were instructed to stop using the word addiction altogether and replace it with abuse. It was a calculated strategy to shift the narrative and protect the brand. Every overdose, every ruined life was reclassified as a user's fault. And while the company publicly denied wrongdoing, they were already planning their next move. Bigger pills, stronger doses, and a marketing campaign that would bury the truth under profit. Because in their world, blame was cheaper than change. By the early 2000s, the evidence of mass addiction was undeniable. But instead of pulling OxyContin from the market, Purdue pushed it harder than ever. Executives saw the growing dependency not as a crisis, but as an opportunity. Repeat customers meant recurring revenue. They released even higher dose pills, including a 160 milligram version, so strong that a single tablet could kill someone not already addicted. Sales reps were trained to call doctors who raised concerns misinformed, and anyone who questioned the drug's safety was labeled anti-progress. When a few employees warned that patients were overdosing on the 80 milligram pills, they were ignored or threatened. One memo captured Purdue's true thinking. The bigger the dose, the bigger the profit. And so the marketing intensified. More bonuses, more contests, more pressure. The company had turned a nationwide health emergency into its most profitable quarter. They didn't slow down, they sped up.
proving that to the Sacklers, addiction wasn't a warning, it was a business model. By 2007, the damage OxyContin had caused could no longer be ignored. Overdose deaths were climbing, communities were collapsing, and investigators had begun uncovering a paper trail of lies stretching back more than a decade. After years of pressure, Purdue Pharma was finally taken to court, accused of deliberately misleading doctors and the public about the safety of its drug. During the trial, grieving families filled the courtroom. Parents who had buried children, spouses who had watched their partners disappear into addiction. One mother stood before Purdue's lawyers and said, "You created this drug, you pushed it, you lied, you killed my son." The company pleaded guilty to misbranding OxyContin and paid a $600 million fine, a record at the time. But inside Purdue, the mood wasn't remorse, it was relief. That same year, OxyContin generated over $3 billion in sales, and executives who pled guilty received bonuses instead of prison sentences. The punishment was nothing more than a business expense, and the Sacklers took it as a sign to keep going. After the trial, doctors across the country began prescribing OxyContin less frequently, finally recognizing the dangers Purdue had spent years hiding. But for millions already dependent, it was too late. When the legal supply dried up, they turned to the streets, desperate to avoid the agony of withdrawal. Heroin dealers quickly filled the void, offering a cheaper, stronger alternative, and within months, the crisis mutated into something even deadlier. According to addiction specialists, 4 out of 5 new heroin users at the time had started with prescription opioids like OxyContin. The drug that began in clinics had now spilled into alleys and prisons, taking lives faster than ever. The Sacklers had created a generation of addicts, and when the system finally tried to pull the plug, the country went into shock. What began as a pharmaceutical success story had become a public health disaster. And while ordinary families were losing everything, Purdue was quietly preparing for its next defense, one that would protect the company and the fortune they had built from pain. By the late 2010s, lawsuits were piling up from nearly every U.S. state, each one demanding accountability for the devastation Purdue had unleashed. Under the weight of billions in potential damages, the company announced bankruptcy. But behind that headline was a calculated move. For years, the Sacklers had been quietly transferring money out of Purdue and into their personal accounts, shielding more than $10 billion from any future settlements. When the courts ordered Purdue to pay $8 billion in penalties, the family claimed the company couldn't afford it, even as they remained among the richest in America. The trick was simple: let the corporation take the blame, then walk away untouched. To make it worse, they negotiated a deal to pay around $6 billion in exchange for full legal immunity. No future lawsuits, no personal responsibility. Critics called it a betrayal of justice, but legally, it worked. The company was an empty shell, the family was protected. And as overdose deaths continued to climb, the Sacklers retreated behind their wealth, untouched by the destruction they had engineered. As the lawsuits settled and the money moved offshore, the Sackler name, once proudly displayed on museum walls and university buildings, became a symbol of greed and denial. Institutions that had once accepted their donations rushed to erase the family's name from their halls, while protesters stood outside museums holding banners that read, "Funded by Death." But even as their reputation crumbled, the damage they caused could not be undone. Since OxyContin's launch, hundreds of thousands of Americans had died from opioid overdoses, and millions more were left dependent, families fractured beyond repair. The statistics were horrifying. Opioids now killed more people each year than car crashes or guns. Yet the Sacklers never admitted guilt. Some even claimed they were victims of unfair media coverage. The real victims, though, were the families left behind, fighting to survive in the wake of a corporate empire built on deceit. The tragedy wasn't just what the Sacklers created, it was how long it took the world to stop believing them. In the end, the story of the Sackler family is not just about one company or one drug. It's about how power, money, and denial can rewrite the rules of morality. From the wards of Creedmoor Psychiatric Hospital to the boardrooms of Purdue Pharma, the same idea persisted, that human suffering could be managed, packaged, and sold. The Sacklers didn't invent pain, but they learned how to monetize it better than anyone else. They turned the promise of relief into a cycle of dependence and called it progress. Decades after OxyContin first hit the market, its shadow still hangs over America.
Towns hollowed out, families broken, generations trapped in quiet despair. And while the family's fortune remains hidden in trusts and offshore accounts, their legacy is written on the faces of those who never recovered. In the beginning, they sought to heal minds by changing brain chemistry. In the end, they changed the chemistry of a nation. Because when profit becomes the purpose, the line between medicine and poison disappears.